Hello everyone, welcome back to another Bible study in the RWBY series, in which we'll be reviewing the biblical themes demonstrated in Volume 2 of the series, in, of course, my crow costume, because I find it funny. If you can turn to the book of 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, we're going to be discussing essentially not the what of Christianity, but the why. Sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. Professor Oobleck in Volume 2 asked Team RWBY an interesting series of questions when on their latest mission against the White Fang. Why do you want to become a huntress? Well, the answers were fairly straightforward. Yang was a thrill seeker. Helping people just adds to the experience. Simple motives, simple goals. Blake wants to change what's wrong with this world, but doesn't know how. Weiss understands the responsibility that comes with her abilities and her family name, and will use them to bring honor to both. And lastly, RWBY wasn't asked simply because she already understands who she is. All that's left is to learn how to put that into practice. Now, all these lines of thinking have biblical applications in what it means to be a Christian, to give us a reason for the hope that's within us. And using these lines of thinking, I want to essentially do a little, fan fiction would be too broad a term. Let's just do an application of the same logic, but to Christianity. Let's say if Professor Oobleck asked them, why are you a Christian? Or why would you want to become a Christian? They each would answer along their same lines of thinking. If they were Christian, they would answer in these ways, from a biblical perspective, of course. Yang's logic, in being just simple motives, simple goals, would be because Jesus rose from the dead. If I'm going to listen to anyone about the afterlife, it's going to be him. 1 Corinthians 2, verses 1 through 2 would back this up. And I, brethren, when I came to you, Paul speaking, did not come with excellence of speech or wisdom, clarifying to you the testimony of God, or declaring to you, rather. For I determined not to know anything among you, except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Simple motives, simple goals. Forget eschatology, soteriology, hermeneutics, and the rest. Those will all come naturally in time. If you want to know what those words mean, ask me in the comments. But here's the point. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Is the historical evidence and the eyewitness accounts of what he did for you and why enough for you to trust him? It's that simple. If you put everything on one thing that you know won't fail, that's a good place to be. Know why you can trust that one thing, and you will ultimately keep your priorities in line. That's why Paul said in 1 Corinthians, same letter, chapter 15 and verse 14, he said, if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty, and your faith is also empty. But then, obviously, the rhetorical response would be, if Christ is written, then our faith has substance. Our preaching is worth listening to. Blake, her response in being ultimately understanding what she needs to do but doesn't know why, her response would be that Jesus died for my sins. I don't understand all the details yet, but what I do understand, I'm grateful for. Faith and evidence is essentially comparing apples with an apple slicer. You use one to enjoy the other. No one eats an apple slicer because that's not what it's supposed to be used for. It's meant to be used to enjoy apples more easily. Faith is what you use, essentially what you trust to be true. That's the definition of it. Evidence is a reason to trust something. Both involve trust, but just like the apple slicer, you can still eat the apple without a slicer, just like you can have faith in something without evidence. However, it requires a greater risk on your part. That's why the definition of faith isn't believing without evidence, that's assumption. We believe because of the evidence. That's faith. And that's why chapter 20 of the Gospel according to John, verse 25 through 29 gives us the story of Thomas, one of the 12 apostles, who was the last to believe that he had risen from the dead. And follow the logic here, because it'll be an important follow-up to what we talked about with Yang. Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. So he said to them, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, referring to not only the scars that would have been left from crucifixion going all the way through his hands. By the way, first century, this was your hand, so this would be inclusive. And as well, a Roman spear that confirmed his death on the cross by shoving a spear in there and causing blood and water to flow out. That meant that his heart had ruptured the serum that ultimately was mixed in the plasma and the fluid. Your blood is in two parts. It had stopped pumping. So just like a blender that had just left its materials, they would eventually start to separate. I guess that depends what you're blending, but nonetheless. He wants to confirm through touching the wounds of Christ that he actually has written. I want to know if it's actually Jesus and not just some lookalike that you guys are using to con me. Otherwise, I will not believe. And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. And Jesus came. The doors being shut, so he entered the room without using the door, and stood in their midst, and said, "Peace to you." Just shalom, chill out. You can imagine they had reason to say that. And then, now catch this is funny, because remember, Jesus wasn't visibly in the room when Thomas said those things. He turned to Thomas and said, "Reach your finger here, and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So going back to the definition of faith in comparison to the apple slicer, was Thomas wrong in doubting Jesus had risen from the dead? Yes and no. He wasn't wrong in that believing Jesus had risen meant that he was God and that his trust needed to be entirely placed in him or he had lost everything. That's a lot of faith to be put on one assumption, right? That's why you don't need assumptions, you need faith. He wants evidence. And it's important not to give that kind of trust to just anything you hear on the street or in a social media feed. However, here's where he was wrong. He was wrong in that he had already seen enough evidence to form a conclusion. The disciples had heard Jesus predicting it would happen. They had seen the miracles that Jesus used to back up his words as from God. He had heard his teachings that included his resurrection would ultimately result in the confirmation that he was God, and now had all personally witnessed that it was true, with the exception of one, when someone told them that it had happened. Thomas needed more evidence. So what did God do? He gave it to him. However, what was ultimately accomplished by this holding out for more evidence? It didn't give him a greater faith than the apostles had. They all saw Jesus just like Thomas did. But the same conclusion was made just 8 days later than everyone else. It's essentially holding off, paying the same price for the video game, but missing out on all the free pre-order DLC content when you still could have gotten it. And that's what ultimately is what we would call the skeptic's dilemma. It's put up by David Wood in his videos. I encourage you to look at that in your own time. But essentially, it's the question, when is enough proof going to be enough? You can ask for more evidence. That's not unreasonable. We have it. But if we keep offering you more and more evidence and you say, "No, that's not good enough. No, I need more. No, I need more." It's fair to say that you need evidence to put your faith in someone, but when is it enough for you to form a conclusion with? And that would ultimately be the kind of Christian that Blake would make. She didn't understand all the details, but what she did understand, she was grateful for. Weiss, her response, "Why would you call yourself a Christian?" Her line of thinking would follow as this: "After all that God's done for me, what can I do but the same?" Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 through 2, Paul the Apostle, speaking from jail, says, "I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling in which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long-suffering, bearing with one another in love." If you remember our Pyrrhonico study, you'd know what kind of love that was. I can clarify it for you, though. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 16, not John, but 1 John. "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren." Notice, ought. Walk worthy of the calling. 1 John chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, same chapter, earlier verses. Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed on us, that we should be called children of God. Therefore the world does not know us, because it did not know him. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not yet been revealed what we shall be, but we know that when he is revealed, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself, just as he is pure. Purified white, right? Understand, God called us his children, so let's live up to that name. Fortunately, he's made that a very simple process for us. We have to be perfect. No, here's the Old Testament law. Here's all that God requires from us. You don't have to memorize all 623. Here's it. Love God and love your neighbor. The rest is commentary. Okay, so how exactly do I do that? How am I equipped for that? Because I don't always want to love people. Is there some help that God's going to give me? Some power on his part that he'll enable me to share his heart towards people with? New Testament demonstration. 1 John 3, chapter 3, verse 23. And this is his commandment, that we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, as he has given us commandment. So understand the correlation there. If you believe in Jesus, he's now in your heart. And the more time he spends there, the more one will replace the other. That's the demonstration. That's the obligation. That's the calling. And that would be the kind of life, the kind of focus, the kind of Christian life that Weiss would be living out, and approaching the same motives that she had for becoming a huntress. That's why she would become a Christian. And then lastly, and most endearingly, Ruby. Ruby wouldn't need to give you a reason. Just like with Professor Oobleck. Doctor, my apologies. She'd know Jesus and simply be learning more about him every single day. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 13. Now abide these three: faith, hope, love. These three, but the greatest of these is love. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have sincere questions or would like to know more about these topics, please leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps is a fan of RWBY but doesn't know enough about Christianity to form conclusions, please share the study with them. Give them the opportunity to ask questions, or perhaps just share the study yourself. Encourage the conversation and let God take it from there. I encourage both, welcome it as the opportunity, and once again would just like to thank you for the time you've taken to listen to this study. I want to remind you that Jesus loves you, and regardless of how you have come to him, remember that when you come to him, he will by no means cast you out. Even if you come to him for the most selfish of reasons, understand his priority is saving your soul. The heart that comes to him, he'll clean after he's caught it.